Hey everybody, this is Andre here with the Kevin Brees channel, and in this video, we're going to be doing a comparison between the Cricut Influence and the Cricut Icon 2. Let's get started. So the Cricut Influence has a 6.2-inch LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 271, and an aspect ratio of 19:9. We got a water drop notch here for the front-facing camera, and this camera is 5 megapixels. The Cricut Icon 2 has a 6-inch LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 268, and an aspect ratio of 18:9. The front-facing camera for this phone is on the bezel, and this camera is 5 megapixels. Now the Cricut Influence has a bit bigger of a screen, but the Cricut Icon 2 looks bigger, and that is not necessarily a good thing, because in this situation, the bezel is just so thick on both the sides and the top especially, that it just makes the phone look so old. If you think back to the early 2010s, this is what smartphones really looked like when they were first starting to be a thing, and this is just not that good of a look. This looks so cheap and so old. Whereas with the Cricut Influence, it does have its faults. I don't particularly care for the bezel at the bottom or this water drop notch here, but at least it does look decently modern, as opposed to the Cricut Icon 2 that looks like some sort of cheap tablet you would get on Amazon. Now the Cricut Influence has 32 gigabytes of internal storage with micro SD card expansion, and the Cricut Icon 2 has 16 gigabytes of internal storage with micro SD card expansion. So the Cricut Influence is going to have a huge advantage here. 16 gigabytes is so small. Typically, the average apps that people use on a daily basis take up anywhere between 3 and 5 gigabytes of space on the phone. And that's not including the system. The system is pretty big too, and everything just keeps getting bigger. So having more space is always important. With some of these lower end phones, they are sometimes able to condense everything down as far as the system goes, but that doesn't help with apps. So 16 gigabytes is really not enough. If you have any amount of photos and videos, you're gonna run out of space real quick. And the micro SD card is kind of a hassle if you have to put pretty much everything on it. So in this situation, that extra 16 gigabytes that the Cricut Influence has is pretty good. Now, neither of these phones have wireless charging or face unlock, but the Cricut Influence at least has a fingerprint scanner that is going to be located right here on the back. Unfortunately, with the Cricut Icon 2, there is nothing, no fingerprint scanner or face unlock, so you're stuck with a PIN or a password, which is super annoying. I don't like to use any of those. That being said, we're going to test out the fingerprint scanner for the Cricut Influence and see how it works. One more time. So as you can see, that was really fast and responsive. Overall, really impressive. I do like the fingerprint scanner for the Cricut Influence. It's located in a really good spot, really easy to use, and definitely better than using a PIN or a pattern or a password or whatever you would end up using on the Cricut Icon 2. Now, taking a look at the rear camera setup here, the Cricut Influence has a 13 megapixel rear camera and a 5 megapixel depth sensing camera. And the Cricut Icon 2 has a 5 megapixel rear camera, and that is it. So neither of them really have any special features like an ultra wide or macro camera, but these are really entry level phones, so that's not really that surprising. So these pictures were taken by the rear cameras of each phone. They both look pretty bad, but the Cricut Icon 2 honestly looks a little bit worse. It's a lot blurrier and the colors are a little bit weird, whereas with the Cricut Influence, at least the colors look sort of okay, and parts of the details in the image are a little bit sharper. But I wouldn't use either of these cameras in a situation where the quality really matters, because they're not really meant for that. These are super low-end phones, and you can tell right away that the camera was not one of the main focuses of these phones. Now, if you're looking for something that has a better camera, I would definitely look into something that's a little bit higher end than these two. These cameras are going to be okay for something like Snapchat or sending pictures to family and friends, or just taking pictures for yourself where the quality doesn't really matter. But if you're trying to really enjoy the pictures you take and take really good quality pictures, then these phones are probably not going to cut it. Now internally, the Cricut Influence is getting 3 gigabytes of RAM with the Qualcomm Snapdragon 460 processor, and the Cricut Icon 2 is getting 1 gigabyte of RAM with the MediaTek Helio A22 processor. Before I even run the Geekbench 5 benchmark test on this phone, I can already tell it's going to be really weak just by looking at the RAM and the processor, it's most likely going to be super low end. So we ran Geekbench 5 benchmark tests on both of these phones, and the Cricket Influence came back with a single core score of 250 and a multi-core score of 1277. And the Cricket Icon 2 came back with a single core score of 125 and a multi-core score of 244. And I believe the Cricket Icon 2 just broke my record for the weakest processor I've seen so far, because this is very weak. You're not going to be able to do anything with this phone besides basic activities. If you're sending text messages, making calls, browsing the web a little bit, depending on what site, because something that has a lot to load is going to load super slow on this. Even web browsing in general is going to be slow. And then of course content consumption, but again, is probably going to load slow. I wouldn't even try to play Galaga or something on this phone, because any type of gaming that takes a decent amount of processing power is probably not going to run very well on this phone. But on the complete other hand, the Cricket Influence has super impressive numbers. The single core score of the Cricket Influence is actually higher than the multi-core score of the Cricket Icon 2. That just goes to show how much of a difference in processing power there is here. The Cricket Influence is not only going to take out your daily activities really easily, but you're also going to be able to do other stuff like photo and video editing. You will be able to play games on this, most likely. To put this into perspective, the Samsung Galaxy Note 8, which was one of the fastest phones out there when it was released a few years ago, has a multi-core score on Geekbench 5 in the 1500s. And with the multi-core score of 1277, the Cricket Influence isn't really that far behind. So that's definitely a good indication of actually how powerful the Cricket Influence is. I was really surprised to see it in such a low-end phone. Usually low-end phones just have pretty alright features, especially at this level. But with the Cricket Influence, the camera and a lot of the other features are worse than usual, but the processor is so much better that in my opinion, it really makes up for it. Definitely, if you're looking for something that's super bare bones, where you're basically not going to use for anything besides texting and calling and maybe looking up a couple things on the internet, a couple videos here and there, the Cricket Icon 2 should be okay. But the Cricket Influence is going to be able to get a lot done for you. And it's honestly a great value if you're doing activities that require a lot of processing power, but don't want to extend your budget to a higher end phone. Now, as far as the battery goes, the Cricket Influence has a 3300 milliamp hour battery, and the Cricket Icon 2 has a 3400 milliamp hour battery. Now, this is so close that the difference probably isn't really even that noticeable. Both batteries are pretty small. They're not the worst out there. The iPhone battery, for example, is a lot worse with the 2815 milliamp hour battery. But all the same, these are pretty small batteries. And if you're looking for a phone that has a lot of battery power and lots of longevity, lots of charge throughout the day, a phone where you can actually use throughout the day without having to charge at all, then these phones might not be for you, because these batteries are definitely on the smaller side. Now, in conclusion, which of these phones is better? I would definitely say the Cricket Influence is the better phone in pretty much every way. There's really no advantage at all the Cricket Icon 2 has over it. The Cricket Influence has not only a much more modern, much more appealing look, but it also has a slightly bigger display, which gives a functional advantage as well. It has double the storage, it has a fingerprint scanner, whereas the Cricket Icon 2 has nothing. And most importantly, it has a much more powerful processor. The Cricket Icon 2 is probably the weakest processor I've seen for a very long time. And the Cricket Influence, on the other hand, probably has the strongest processor out of phones in a similar price range, so that's actually really impressive. I personally would say the processor is the true deal breaker here. The camera, yeah, the Cricket Influence is still actually a little bit better than the Cricket Icon 2 in the camera department, but both cameras are pretty bad in my opinion, so I don't really count that. Really, the main difference here is going to be the processor. So definitely, I would say if you're looking for an entry-level phone to do basic activities with, don't really care a whole lot about the camera, but want something that really gets the best value for your money, I would say the Cricket Influence is still a really great deal. But if you want to get more info on the pricing and availability of these phones, be sure to check the link in the description, because this stuff is always changing. And if you want to learn more about the phones themselves, you can definitely watch the reviews of the phones on the channel. But I hope you guys liked the video. If you did, be sure to leave a thumbs up and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one.